Hello everyone. Before we start the panel, I would like to acknowledge that the University of Arizona sits on the original homelands of indigenous peoples who have stewarded this land since time immemorial. Aligning with the university's core value and diverse and inclusive community, it is an institutional responsibility to recognize and acknowledge the people, culture, and history that make up the Wildcat community. At the institutional level, it is important to be proactive in broadening awareness throughout campus to ensure our students feel represented and valued. Welcome everyone, my name is Jessica Retis. I'm a faculty member at the University of Arizona and the director of the Masters in Bilingual Journalism. We are currently accepting applications for the fall 2024 semester, 2021 semester. We are very excited to receive our first cohort of bilingual journalists in Tucson. You can find more information in the link that we are just sharing in the chat, and you can also email if you have any questions. Thank you so much for joining us for the third session of our fall 2020 series, news coverage of the US presidential election, gender, race, and language diversity in the digital age. But before we start the panel, I would like to introduce journalism student Ana Teresa Espinosa. She's the vice president of the NGI student chapter. And at the University of Arizona, she has some information on how we're going to proceed with this panel. Ana Teresa?
Hello, everyone, and thank you, Professor Retis. My name is Ana Teresa Espinosa, and I will be helping conduct the Q&A portion of this panel. If you have any questions for our panelists, feel free to put them in the chat in English or in Spanish. We can always translate for them. But otherwise, enjoy and thank you.
Thank you, Ana Teresa. So let's start introducing our panelists today. We have Eileen Traux. She's a veteran journalist specialized in immigration and politics for so many years now. Eileen, I'm not going to reveal your age. Her work has been published in the US, in Latin America, and Spain, such as the Washington Post, Vice, the New York Times en Español, among others. She's authored 3 books, including Dreamers and Immigrant Generations Fight for the American Dream. Eileen is content director for the International Symposium on Immigration Journalism, a yearly event celebrated in Spain. After 15 years living in California, she's now a happy Michigander. You say that, Michigander? Nice. She's a Knight Wallace Fellow and a Carter Center Fellow. Her current project is about higher education and mental health services access to foreign documented youth in the Midwest. Welcome, Eileen.
Thank you so much for inviting me, and thank you everyone for connecting in these weird times. It's a pleasure.
Thank you. So we also have Yara Marin. She was born and raised in Phoenix, Arizona. She graduated from Arizona State University with a Bachelor of Science of Family and Human Development and earned a master's degree in public administration with an emphasis in public policy and government. She began her journey in the nonprofit world with just 16 years old, so young. She volunteered every day after school to help register new voters. She recognized that while she wasn't old enough to vote yet, she could inspire others to use their voice and cast their votes. Yara has always had a passion for social justice and continues advocating to achieve social and economic justice for all as the political director for Arizona with Mi Familia Vota. Welcome, Yara.
Welcome, everyone. Thank you so much for inviting us and for taking time out of your days to be here. It's a pleasure to be here.
Wonderful. Thank you so much. And we also have Eduardo Sainz. He was born and raised in Sonora, Mexico. Eduardo comes from a family who instilled values of unity, justice, and consistency. At the age of 13, Eduardo migrated to Tucson, Arizona, with his parents and siblings, with the hope of a better education and economic stability. As a community organizer, he believes in order to change the political landscape in Arizona and the country, Latinos need to develop a political infrastructure through civic participation and leadership development. Through his past involvement in Mi Familia Vota, he has led large-scale voter registration, get out the vote efforts in the state of Arizona, and engaging thousands of volunteers and empowering families and leaders to speak out and take action in their communities. He also serves as council member at the University of Arizona Hispanic Community Council, and Eduardo continues his vision for a better Arizona as the current Arizona State Director of Mi Familia Vota. Welcome, bienvenido, Eduardo.
Thank you so much, a pleasure.
Okay, let's start this. So it's predicted that we are going to have a record of 32 million Latinos that are projected to be eligible to vote in the 2020 presidential elections. Hispanics will be the largest racial or ethnic minority group in, in these elections, accounting for just over 13% of the eligible voters. The estimation exposes the growth of Hispanic shares of eligible voters, up from 9% in the 2008 and 7% in 2000 election. What do you think are the main challenges for the Latino communities to face this and to cast their votes, right? So
I
let's
can
start
start.
with,
Yeah.
okay.
Yeah, I can start. So I think that there are a lot of issues that Latinos and that communities face when it comes to casting their vote, right? We know that there are many barriers, this year, the pandemic being a huge one. But despite that, we also know that there are things like access to transportation. A lot of communities sometimes don't have cars, and polling places are not always conveniently placed next to bus routes or light rail stops, right? Making it easier and accessible for Latinos or communities of color to go and vote. We also know that there's things like time constraints. We have a lot of the Latino communities who are working families and are working multiple jobs to make ends meet and to pay their bills and support their families. And so sometimes these time constraints makes it difficult for them to find some free time to go and cast their vote, to go to the ballot, or to really educate themselves on what's on their ballot. And then, believe it or not, there are still issues around accessibility to internet or to phone. I think that a lot of us, we are so easily just kind of, we know we have our phones, we know we have Wi-Fi, and we don't really think that other people don't have access to these services, but it's a very real problem. And we know that there are a lot of communities that, don't have Wi-Fi, don't have cell phone service. And so they're unplugged, and they don't have ways to call and ask about resources, to call or look up information, educate themselves on what's on their ballots, or, even hop in and online and check if they're still registered or eligible to vote. And so these are some of the immediate issues that I can think of, but there are definitely so many different barriers when it comes to voting and access to voting in the Latino community.
Eduardo?
No, absolutely. Thank you, Yara. Latinos have been hit the hardest when it comes down to the pandemic. I'm a father, and our kids are suffering through the public education system. The legislature has been defunding our schools, and we don't have enough resources for our schools to have quality education. As Latinos, we also are the group that are disproportionately affected when it comes down to access to healthcare. Our families are, you know, uh, essential workers that are back in the field, having conversations with folks, risking their lives in the middle of this pandemic. And then also the economic stability that we, as immigrants come and seek in this country, it's also something that as Latinos, we also been hit the hardest when it comes down to unemployment. So all of those different factors that are going on in our lives also take a barrier for individuals to go out, get registered, and participate in election. There's also 150,000 Latinos in the state of Arizona that happen to be legal permanent residents that can become naturalized U.S. citizens, and by becoming naturalized citizens, then they can have the right to vote, but haven't done so. And that has to do with this narrative from the Trump administration of making it harder for immigrants to apply for naturalization, trying to dismantle institutions where there are support systems for Latinos to get help. Very recently, he was also trying to almost double and triple the cost for some immigration processes. And those are barriers that are put in place for communities not to thrive and not to be able to have access to our democracy. On top of that, for example, very recently, we were able, a federal judge ruled in our favor to extend the voter registration deadline until October 23rd. And our argument was simple. Our community has been suffering and they haven't had enough time to register to vote. In just one day, this was a historic win. We were able to register 50,000 voters. And right now, The Republican National Committee, the governor, and a couple of other Republican county recorders filed an appeal at the Ninth Circuit Court. And that appeal, we were able to negotiate to be able to have the voter registration deadline extended until October 15, which is tomorrow. But it goes back to the hypocrisy that we hear from elected officials, Republicans, our congressional delegation, of dismantling and making it harder for our communities to go out and participate. There's no such thing. There are states like Colorado, California, where you could register to vote the same day, and the same day you can vote. Why are we putting so many roadblocks when our communities also already have so much to worry about, that we want to make sure that by expanding this voter registration deadline, we could also reach out to more of our communities to make sure that they participate in this election. I think one of the other biggest barriers that we keep hearing is this narrative of the Trump administration, and our Republican congressional delegation, if voting by mail is secure, and raising this question that it's not secure, that there's going to be fraud, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera, that it's nonsense. And the only thing that is happening is trying to put misinformation when it comes down to on the elections. There are a couple of congressmen on our delegation that have been at the front lines, telling people that voting by mail is not secure, that there's a lot of fraud, when them themselves have been voting by mail in the last 4 or 5 elections. Arizona has been voting by mail for over 30 years. We are a state that have the PEBL, which is the permanent voting list, and close to 80% of the electorate already participates to vote by mail. And in the middle of a pandemic, I believe that that's the most safe way to participate in our great democracy, from our comforts of our homes, being able to sit down, practice social distance, etc. But when we hear these narratives coming from the highest authority, which is the White House, and telling us that just generate confusion in our communities, and I'm worried. I've been getting questions from our volunteers, questions from our staff, people that were knocking on their doors, and the question is, would my vote get counted? Is it safe to vote by mail? And this fake narrative is working. And when I say working, is that some elected officials count of winning by making it so hard and miserable and confusing for communities of colors to participate. So that's how they win, by disenfranchise communities of color, disenfranchising individuals that traditionally don't go out and vote. But I'm so thankful to be in this organization where we can provide good information and motivate our communities to continue to participate in our democracy.
So, Eileen, we have heard from Eduardo and Yara this understanding from a community that is advocating, right, to promote more participation from the Latino communities. In your role as a journalist covering these kind of stories, what is your sense? What are the main challenges that Latino voters have, especially in California, right, that you know best?
Yes, well, I can talk about California, but I think we also have to mention what are the challenges for journalism and for Latino communities in the rest of the country. Because, of course, the first obstacle that we have is that the media in general tends to cover more the candidates, the names, the events that are created a conversation every day. If someone tweets something, if there's, like Eduardo said, these declarations that try to confuse people, but we are not reporting enough, especially mainstream media and English language media, on the whole process of the electoral participation. Where can you register? when can you register? What options do you have to make a plan to vote? What time? What's your timeline for that? Many people still don't know that some of the mailboxes to drop your ballot will be open up to 10 days before election day. I really don't understand why we are not putting that information in front of everything, in front of the other talking that we have every day from politicians. And in the case of Trump, I mean, that takes the agenda, and we are not doing a good job there. However, in states like California or Texas or Arizona, where we have a strong Latino community organized, where we have networks. I mean, Mi Familia Vota is a very good example of what we can achieve with those networks. Maybe we have more resources. And even if you live in Los Angeles and you don't read anything in the LA Times or in La Opinión or in Univision, whatever thing, if this is your first time voting, you probably will be contacted or will know about these organizations that can help you to approach to the process. To me, the main concern is about these Latinos that are in states that are of relatively recent immigration. The states in the mid, now I live in the Midwest, and I'm realizing that, God, we should pay attention here. I mean, that we owe that to this part of the country, because the immigration here started in the 80s and the 90s. And yes, it's not super numerous, but many people can vote already. Many people have children that can vote now. And because the Latino population density is not as notorious, and also because of the distances, Yara was telling at the beginning, and I think she's right, that sometimes transportation is a huge obstacle for someone to vote. So I see that some states like Kansas, they are already having this kind of groups that are encouraging and that they are giving information to people, to young people who are voting for the first time about the process. But in general, we still don't have that network that will allow us to approach to the Latino community, to approach to new citizens, either because they reached the 18-year-old age or because they became citizens after a while. We are not engaging. We are not going there. So it's like, you know, el huevo y la gallina. What's first? It's first a lack of representation, and therefore we don't have many Latino communities in there, or is that because we don't have many Latino communities, we don't have the representation? I mean, in most of, except Illinois, that has like 2 million Latinos, something like that. The other states have an average between the 200,000 and 400,000 Latino people living in those states. Those are not big numbers, but for that reason, we are not paying enough attention in this. And during the pandemic, I mean, it's really, really complicated.
Thank you, Eileen. I want to ask this question to Yara and Eduardo, because in this class is the title of this, one of the main group of students that are here from the class that is called Latinx and the News Media in the United States. And one of the assignments that journalism students have for this class is to map Latino organizations, right? So I'm trying to explain journalists how important it is for them to understand the role of Latino organizations and to use them as news sources of information, because when Latinos are in the news media coverage, they tend to have official sources only. So they talk about Latinos, but not with Latinos, right? So in that sense, I would like to ask Yara and Eduardo if they can please explain the main mission of Mi Familia Vota and why it's so important to have organizations like yours promoting voter engagement within Latino communities.
Yeah, I can go ahead and go first. So I think Mi Familia Vota, Our mission is really to build Latino political power, electoral power, and that's through strengthening the electorate, right? Through having that accurate representation, strengthening local infrastructures, and by making sure that Latinos in our communities are participating and practicing that constitutional right to vote. And so we do that through a variety of programs. We know that voter engagement is one of the many avenues in which we have to ensure that our Latinos are participating, right? We also know, for example, climate change disproportionately affects Latinos. And as a result, COVID and the pandemic has disproportionately affected Latinos, and we've seen increased death rates when it comes to the Latino community. We also know with things like the citizenship, right? Being able to provide citizenship opportunities and resources so that our community can be naturalized and they can register to vote. And so I think that there are so many different avenues that as an organization we are taking to ensure that we can be a support when it comes to that Latino community. And I also think, kind of as noted before, right, our community faces so many different barriers when it comes to voting. And in order to provide the support that we do, we need to be able to identify those barriers and find modern solutions. And so that is something that we are really dedicated to doing. And for example, with the most recent pandemic, right, knowing that, hey, it's been more difficult to reach voters and educate our community. So let's, fight to extend that voter registration deadline. Let's create a hotline so that our voters can come to us if we can no longer go to them at this moment. It is, whether it's going door to door or strategically placing our staff and volunteers at plazas or locations that are heavily populated, where we know we can be a resource and reach our communities. And so I think that these are some of the different ways and avenues in which we're ensuring that we can be a voice for our community and letting them know, right? Like, you don't have to be hiding out in the shadows. We are here. We're here, we're with you, and we want to make sure that we're representing you.
And thank you, Yara. I think I'm so thankful that, the students in this class is also looking into mapping the organizations that are out there for support of the Latino communities. I first want to start a little bit talking about the history of Mi Familia Vota and why we got started. Mi Familia Vota got started out of times of fear. And I apologize, but I get so emotional on this because it affected my life. Mi Familia Vota started in Proposition 187 in California in the 80s. And that proposition was a very similar law that came into the books in Arizona around SB 1070. Proposition 187, what it was is trying to dismantle and make it harder for people that look like me, that are brown skinned, that have an accent, that look like Mexican descent, etc., to have access to education, to have access to public services, etc. And back then, a group of organizers got together and started to mobilize Latinos to the polls. And unfortunately, the reflection of that election was that we were begging people to vote on our favor. We were begging them because they were not on our side. Voters really wanted to have this Prop 187 be on the books and plain simple be racist and not have access to people. It didn't matter if we were from here or not. What it mattered was to make it so miserable for us to feel like we have to travel outside of the state, go back to our countries, etc. And out of that reflection, we knew that we needed to build political power. And we needed to ensure that folks that are, that can become naturalized US citizens are becoming naturalized US citizens. Folks that are, young people that are turning 18, that are registered to vote, that we are also running for office and representing our community's issues and values. And, we thought that if we could change LA County, we could change California. And if we could change California, we could change, a couple of different states that we have high Latino populations. If we could change those states, we could change the United States. And by changing the United States, we also knew that we could change the world and also change those, our home countries where, it's so difficult for us to thrive that we have decided to leave everything behind to come to another country. Fortunately, I was a college student in Tucson in 2010, and there was the day that John Brewer had the opportunity to sign or veto SB 1070. And we walked out of our college institutions. I remember high schools walking out across the state, etc. And we were on downtown in Tucson at the Arizona State Building. And I remember protesting, talking to members of the media, why we were protesting. And there came a white woman on the third floor that had a sign that said, haha, she signed it. And that sign truly triggered me into ensuring that I would fight for having individuals that align with my values in order for my community to thrive. So, we saw it in California, we saw it in Arizona, history repeating itself. And it was so difficult and there was so much fear that I saw my family members literally packing everything that they own and going back to Mexico, going to other states. And we decided to stay. And here we are building political power. It was a very dark days, but it was Mi Familia Vota and other organizations were born out of that fear. We're born out of the fear, but also the resiliency that we have to ensure, and because we know that there's a better Arizona, that there is space for all of us to thrive in this great country. And that has been our key to ensure that we build political power, has been into tapping into that motivation of every single one of us and ensuring that we build that political power. In 2016, it was a bittersweet election. We were able to say goodbye, adios, Arpaio, but then we had the same type of history being repeated at the national level with Trump, a person that has been insulting our community since day one, since the day that he announced that he was running for presidency. And we had so many victories. That same year, we were able to pass the most progressive increases on the minimum wage. And that's why right now Arizona has one of the highest minimum wages across the country, paying $12 an hour. We were able to see the first woman to serve at the US Senate delegation, Kristen Sinema, and also elect the first woman that happens to be a Latina to serve as mayor of the city of Tucson. Those are victories that we have built together in the last 10 years. And it has been because of those moments of fear that it sparked all of this mobilization to ensure that we could see a better Arizona.
Thank you so much, Eduardo. If we're in this working together, is because we believe in what we're doing. Your field is in the community organization, my field is in the classroom. Eileen is working also in the journalism, and I'm very glad and honored that you guys accepted to share these kind of ideas, because it's different if I tell them than listening to the actual people that are doing this, right? So my question will be to Eileen. Eileen, why do you think it's so important for journalists and journalism training right now, right, to understand these complex realities of the Latino vote in the United States?
Well, I think that's key, and especially for journalists in these times where most of the information is passing through media, and unfortunately also through social media. But let's leave that aside. But from journalists, I think the biggest problem that we have in the electoral narrative when we are talking about Latinos is thinking that we have a single block of Latino voters that are all the same, that have the same values, that have the same political principles, and that want to vote in the same way. Sometimes I can't believe that we are still doing that, and we are still counting in polls and in every political calculation in the same bucket the vote from Cubanos or Venezolanos in Florida and the vote from Salvadoreños in California, or the vote of people from Mexico in Illinois. The origin of these people is different. The political challenges that they face are different. And the most important thing for me, the thing that unites all of these people at the moment of electing a government is that they are US citizens. And for some reason, from journalism and many times from politicians, we keep separating what the US citizen electorate will do and what the Latinos in the US will do. As if it was a completely different war, as if it was that Latinos vote with other things in mind and not about education access for their children, if they are going to be able to pay the mortgage or not, if they are going to be able to keep their job or not, if they will have access to a health insurance. Those are the things that people has in mind when they go to vote. Average people, regular people, US citizens think in those things when they are considering where they are going to put their trust and who are they voting. The same thing happens with Latinos. We have the same problems, the same motivations. But for some reason, we are still talking about migration as a super important issue that can decide the Latino vote, that huge Frankenstein that is called the Latino vote. We still think in, of course, that racial violence has a role and plays a role in that. Of course, there are some issues that affect ethnic communities, minority communities, racial communities. But the main subjects, the main areas that concern to all of us when we are going to vote are the same for the Latinos. So to me, what we are missing is trying to find out what are the economic expectations of our community and what are they lacking, not as Latinos, as a community maybe that lives in a non-wealthy neighborhood, as a community that maybe needs interpretation services for certain members of the family. I mean, we have different features in our communities, in our families, but defining that just by Latino, to me, is a huge mistake. And that's why also sometimes the polls say one thing and then the vote say another thing, because we are not measuring in the right way. To me, the key here, one of the keys here is that we have to work very hard to restart, to rebuild local journalism and community journalism, because this thing that I'm saying now, local newsrooms understand it, and they understand that it doesn't matter if your last name is Perez or Smith or Jing, you are facing the challenge that this community is facing. But unfortunately, we know what's happening with local media. And in that sense, we are just becoming this abstract idea of Latino voters that I don't think we are covering in a fair way. And one last comment, and this is very important also. We have from the media this idea that Latinos, because of migration issues or because of racial issues, will automatically vote Democrat. And I see that very often in American media is missing the piece of information that Latino communities also have core values that are pretty similar to those held by the Republican Party. When it comes to the right to abortion, when it comes to same-sex marriages. So all of those factors affect, and for some kind, most of the time, the media wants to play blind to them.
Thank you so much, Eileen. I have more questions, but students are already entering their questions. So I'm gonna let Ana Teresa start reading the questions from students that are already in the chat.
So the first question we have is from Clara Migoya, and she says, we know that anti-immigrant policies and legislation are not exclusive from one party. How will Mi Familia Vota encourage political engagement beyond the election?
Absolutely. I can start, si quieres, Yara, and then you can take it from there. You know, we know that civic engagement doesn't end on November 3rd. Mi Familia Vota has been around for close to 15 years, and we do year-round civic engagement. We hold elected officials accountable to the issues that we care. Those issues that we care is about immigration, education, healthcare, worker rights, ensuring that we have access to our democracy. And we believe that also climate change is also a great issue. Um, we hold elected officials accountable, from local municipalities to the US Senate to the president. And we're going to make sure that when we elect individuals, also from the right, from the left, those individuals are accountable to us. One of the other items that we are also looking into is how can we ensure that our community, ourselves, we can also run for office and be able to govern our local municipalities, be able to govern when it comes down to the state legislature, when it comes down to our city council. How can we ensure that there will be good leaders making the right decisions for our communities? That happens when we organize and when we provide access for individuals to run for office. You know, there's a question reporters keep asking us this election cycle and in 2016, will the Latino vote wake up, and will the giant sleeping wake up this year? And, you know, I ask myself, why are Latinos not going out to vote at the same levels as white counters are? And the answer is about investment. There has been investment in the white communities when it comes down to their education, when it comes down to civic participation, when it comes down to every aspect of our lives, when it comes down to even access to credit. There could be a mediocre white guy that would, you know, beat a Latina on elected office when it comes down to um, running for office. And it's not because the Latina doesn't have a good profile, it's because of how the investment in the white community has been disproportionately affected on Latinos and communities of color. Plain simple. The more that you invest, the more that people are going to participate. And you know, when reporters ask me that question, my rebuttal is, well, both candidates need to invest in our communities to ensure that they have the information that they need to make those decisions. As our colleague was mentioning earlier, the Latino communities, we are so we care about so many different issues, and you know, there are some conservative Latinos, there are progressive Latinos, but we need to make sure that there is investment. And the truth of the matter is that unfortunately in this political system, sometimes politicians want to suppress our vote to make sure that they can continue to be on power. But thankfully, organizations like ourselves have been at the front line investing in the Latino community by ensuring that there are avenues for us to get educated, avenues for us to ensure that we fill that gap. You know, as we were talking it earlier, there is this huge gap when it comes down to not having the information that we need. There's this huge gap on the economic spectrum. There's this huge gap on our mental health, etc., that organizations needs to step in because our elected officials have been not paying attention and investing on those gaps that we have as communities.
We have another question from Mandy. How can media cover the growing diverse Latinx communities in a way that is representative, fair, and valuable? Yeah, I'm interested in this too, sis.
Yes, well, it's super, super simple. We need more Latinos in newsrooms. That's the key. I mean, if we keep having these super white newsrooms telling the story of the Latino communities, we will always have it wrong. Uh, this is very notorious right now in those mainstream media, especially newspapers, the New York Times, the Washington Post, because when Trump won, it was like suddenly they discovered that there's migration around and there's immigration issues, and they start covering as if this was new. And I have a lot of colleagues that teach me about how covering migration when I came here 16 years ago. And those stories that we have covered for a very long time about family separation, about the detention of children by immigration authorities, about the life of binational communities in the border, they started doing it after Trump won. And they would announce this as if it was a huge discovery. And then people, in general, inside and outside the US, would think that all of that was happening because of Trump, because it was the first time that it was extensively portrayed in these newspapers. A huge danger, but because if you present that and you create that impression, then the impression is also that once Trump is gone, all of that is going to be gone. And so we have been having this for at least 20 years, a bit more. And it is not Trump, it's the system, because Obama was here and it was the same, and the previous was here and it was the same. We have a system that allow people like Trump doing the things that Trump does. So the only way to change that is to having members of that community covering those communities, talking in editorial meetings, talking to real people, and giving that input, that cultural input that we all need, that we need in newsrooms. You wouldn't ask someone to write about soccer if that's a person that has never been in a stadium. Why sometimes we see reports about Latino communities from guys who have never stepped in one of the southern states where you have dynamic communities of Latino people. So to me, that's the most important thing. So what I'm telling you is that you have that response in your hands. We need more people like you going to newsrooms, not only to Spanish language newsrooms, but going to big newsrooms and giving that input. The Washington Post, I think it was like 2 years ago, they got a new number of subscriptions. So they decided to expand their coverage about immigration, and they hired 6 new reporters. And one of these reporters, his last name is Rodriguez or Ramirez, I don't remember, but you know, he's a Latino. He used to be based in New York. He moved to DC, and he was assigned to cover migration. And he traveled to El Paso, and he did a series of 3 pieces about the life in the border of El Paso, Juarez, and how people cross from one side to the other to work or to study. And the 3 pieces were in the front page of the Washington Post. A story that we all know is happening, that is not breaking news at all, but they were discovering this. And I contacted one of the editors, and the response was, but this is a Latino person, he knows. So we have to push for the subjects that we want to read and want to see. We have to refuse, we have to complain, to speak out whenever we see a misrepresentation of the Latino community in media, but especially we need more Latinos in newsrooms.
Thank you, Eileen. So in this class, it's very interesting because we have Latino and non-Latino students. So we need to do the work in both areas. For the Latino students, you know, you have to push and get in the newsroom, right? And then for non-Latino students, it's very, very important that you are educated in this type of issues, because that will make you a better journalist. So and this is related to one of the questions that we have here from one student. She says, as someone who is not part of the Latinx community, what is the one piece of advice you would suggest to help support accurate representation? Thank you, Faith, for your question.
Yes, thank you for that question. Well, of course, I mean, the fact that you are asking that means a lot, because that means that you want to do a good job and you want to connect to your audiences. And I think that, I mean, that can be done, of course. To me, the most important thing is that you have to approach the communities that you don't know, that you are not familiar with, without all the cliches and all the information that you might have from other times or other places, or even cultural misunderstandings that sometimes we have happening in this country. If you approach to new communities willing to learn and willing to listen and being super conscious that you are the media, meaning that the voice of this person is going to go through you so other people can listen to that voice, that you are just an amplifier and not an interpreter, that's when you are doing a good service. And also, and I've said this before to Anglo-Saxon journalism students, if you can get in one of those newsrooms, like the one that I described in the Washington Post, and you can share that passion about really learning about cultures and really learning about communities in their daily lives, and not only when there's breaking news, that's huge. That's huge. Unfortunately, in some of these places, they still will listen with more attention to someone who is not a minority than to someone who is.
Yeah. So the next question we have is from Caroline Rose, and she says, have you noticed a large increase in the number of Latino voters since Mi Familia Vota began 15 years ago?
I can start with some of the most current numbers, and then Eduardo has definitely been here longer than I have, and so I would love for him to share what he's seen prior to mine. But yeah, so I think at least here in 2020, right, a way to really define how many Latinos are turning out and an increase in participation, and what percentage of our community is Latino is through the census, right? And so most recently, and from the last census, right, we knew that 31.7% of Arizona residents are Latinos. Like, that is a huge number. And during the 2020 primary elections in August, we also saw in Arizona record turnout from Latino voters. In addition to that, we know that the Latino community is the fastest growing segment of the electorate. And according to our voter database that we have here at Mi Familia Vota, which is compiled from different counties across the state, we've also seen that voter registration records are at over 500,000, which is a little over 560,000 that are already registered. So that makes Latinos in Arizona 17% of all registered voters. And on top of that, Latinos are voting by mail. We're at over close to 300,000 Latinos who sign up to receive their ballots by mail or are on the tablet. And so all of these numbers, they are large, right? And we know that these numbers and this turnout wouldn't be happening if organizations like Mi Familia Vota or our partners were not out there doing the work in the field, registering voters, having these conversations, storytelling, and you know, and encouraging voters to participate, not only to register, but to participate and to make sure that they are a voice for their communities, for their neighbors, for their nana and tata who might not be able to vote, and really having those heart-to-heart conversations, right?
Thank you so much, Yara. Yes, in addition to that, absolutely, we have seen an increase, and that happens to do because of the point that I was trying to make earlier about the investment. As we're investing, as we're having conversations, as we're educating Latinos, as we're providing that key transition, individuals are excited to thrive. Individuals are, our community wants to participate, and our communities wants their voices to be heard. And sometimes it's because of the lack of information that we have and the lack of investment that our communities continue to underperform. But once we invest, once we provide information, and once we fill those gaps, communities are ready to thrive and to participate and become, high propensity voters that are actively in the whole spectrum of democracy and not just elections.
I'm going to take the next question, Ana Teresa. So I have a student that says, forgive me if this is tangential. What is the best counter argument against folks who point to the Reconquista movement to fuel their own anti-immigrant sentiment? And he says, have some family members I'd love to be able to productively debate with. So I guess the students are learning important information in classroom, and they are wanting to share this information with family members, which is absolutely great. And as I was telling the students, sometimes these kind of classes that are more critical to our society gives them food for thoughts. Not better time for say this, right? So I guess these students are asking for some advice on, because we've been there, we all in our own families, we have these type of conversations as well, because within Latino communities, we have people that are more conservative or more progressive. So how come, young people can better deal with these type of situations?
And to me, that's the most productive conversation. If you start by talking about this to the people who are close to you, around you, you have more possibilities of getting to a point where this is actually an interchange of information and not only just an argument. The Reconquista term, I think it's very, very charged, and I don't know if you are in Arizona. In the case of California, where I spend a lot of time, it is used, but it is not widely used. It's like a term that certain groups use to reivindicate their ideology, but I don't think every immigrant or every person who is an activist towards migrant justice thinks about Reconquista, because conquista and reconquista means that you are stepping into someone else or into something else to impose what you think is the right thing. That's the concept of conquista. It's not that we are going to exchange ideas, conversations, assets, problems, and we are going to try to build something new and hopefully something better. But that description that I just did, that's a description of migration. And that's a description of communities that successfully integrate other people in order to have their communities. So whenever someone says Reconquista, I say, you know what, I don't think anyone can conquer anyone at this point, but what we do need is to have diversity in our communities. And then I would go with simple examples. What's the favorite food of one of those uncles that are telling that immigrants are not okay here? Well, maybe that person just had Chinese or just had, I know, another food. What brand of phone is he using? An iPhone? Because this is made mainly by Indian citizens working in California. It's just the fact that stop presenting this issue as they and us, them and us. It's not reinforcing the differences, but helping people to understand that us includes them, that the arriving of immigrants is not something that will happen and we have to stop. The arriving of immigrants and the human movement around the world is something that already happened. And it's already part of our communities. And we just have to decide what kind of community are we. But I think acknowledging that maybe your child's best friend sitting next to him in school is the son or daughter of immigrants, it's a good start. Making people acknowledge that we are part of a community that is already diverse, especially in certain states.
I want to jump in with one question that, and then Ana Teresa, you can read the other questions, or maybe the panelists can read the questions and start answering, because we only have 10 minutes left. But this is one very important. So we have here journalism students and educators, and especially I'm thinking on journalism students, and how important it is for them to keep contact with organizations regarding these different issues. And I guess my question would be for Mi Familia Vota representatives here, how is your relationship with journalists, right? And how you communicate these, on the importance of having journalists that are aware of the reality and doing a good job, not coming with a mic and saying, okay, can you tell me the history of Mi Familia Vota, right? When you notice that, and they are not prepared. And in the case of Eileen, I would like to ask her the other way around, right? How important is for journalists to get closer to organizations, to know what they're doing, to be closer to people that are actually doing things and programs for communities. In this case, we're talking about Latino communities. We can talk about the variety of our society, elder people, LGBTQ, different groups that are in our diverse society. I guess my question is that for organizations, how important it is to have a relationship with journalists, and for journalists to keep contact with organizations.
I can start. We have great relationships with journalists. We have great relationships with the news directors at the different stations that we're operating when it comes down to Spanish language media, when it comes down to English media, because it's critical. We also have a national team that has those good relationships with reporters, and some, when it comes down to the national outlets, it's a little bit harder to develop those relationships, but we try our best. I think that we also want to make sure that we understand, that it's not just a superficial relationship, but that it is a relationship when we both understand the needs of our scope of work, and that we are in constant communication of how things are being developed and the different initiatives that we're working on. We also serve as, have to have those relationships with individuals and with those reporters. Sometimes we are not the ones in front of the camera, but we also help individuals connect with other individuals that could be part of their stories. So we're also a research for the news director, for reporters, etc., to have a full-on sense of when it comes down to writing about a story.
Eileen? You're muted, you're muted.
I know. I think that's the phrase that I've heard the most this year. You're muted. Well, of course, yes, it's super essential to have this approach to organizations, to people who are in the field and are talking to people. And I would tell you that to me, I worked for 7 years in La Opinión, which is the largest Spanish language newspaper, and I've covered migration like forever. So I wouldn't be able to do most of my work if it weren't for these organizations, and if it were not for the will and the availability that these organizations have to help you to understand, so you can explain things to others. But also, I think that beyond getting information and write about things that these organizations are doing, these organizations also, in some cases, help, if they connect very well with media, can help to build an agenda and can help to put pressure in politics and politicians. And to me, the best example is the Dreamers movement. Among all the organization and all the pro-immigrant movements in the country, when Dreamers started organizing, my intuition is that that's because their age, that they were very talented in sending messages because they are another generation, they were able to connect super well with media, super well. They would pitch you stories, they would send you, they would identify what's the main interest of your media or the work that you normally do, and they would send you that particular piece of information. They were very, very savvy when talking about the communication with media and with journalists. And to me, that's the reason why their civil disobediences, their lobby in the Congress or with local authorities was very successful. One, because the general public, not only the Latino or Asian American or immigrant public, was aware about what was happening with this youth. And second, because of that visibility, politicians were forced to listen to them, to consider what they were saying. And at the end, that's the reason why we have DACA now. This is not because Barack Obama was a very nice person and loved Dreamers. This is because Dreamers built a strong movement, worked together with the media understood the message, and that's the result.
I think we have time for one more question. Ana Teresa, the last two questions, right? Yeah. Julia and David.
Do I read them both together? Or
yeah, both together,
okay.
Yeah.
Okay. So the first question we have is from Julia, and she says, how have your GOTV efforts changed with the pandemic? What programs have worked well to get younger adults engaged? And the second question we have is from Gabriel, and it says, there has been many events by the current administration to weaken voter registration, especially in these past couple of months before the election, with all focus going towards the current SCOTUS nominee hearing. How can Mi Familia Vota highlight this situation?
Those are both amazing questions, super important. I can go ahead and answer the first one around get out the vote efforts. I think that the pandemic has changed the way that we do everything, right? Especially when it comes to voter registration and get out the vote efforts. I think that as Mi Familia Vota, voter registration and that door-to-door contact is our bread and butter. It's the way that, like I've mentioned before, we have to strategically place ourselves in locations where we can be accessible to people, right? Whether that means we place ourselves in plazas or we're doing that door-to-door contact. And so some of the ways that we've had to adjust was at the very beginning when we had a lot of these restrictions, we had to kind of transition from field operations to digital, right? So that was a lot of social media, a lot of micro targeting, a lot of making sure that we had advertisements and messaging and resource, whether it's hotlines, documents, links for our community. And most recently with getting out the vote, we know some of those restrictions have been lifted. And so we are still continuing that door-to-door contact, but now it's so different, right? We have to wear face shields and a mask under the face shields. We, knock on that door if you're doing door-to-door contact and then stepping away a little over 6 feet to make sure you keep that distance, right? It's also sometimes we are just delivering literature to people's doors and hanging them on their doors. And, that literature has everything from who are the elected officials in your district, or contact us if you have questions, making sure that, you practice your right to vote. And so we've had to get really, really creative and very strategic when it comes to get out the vote and when it comes to voter registration as a result of the pandemic. But at the end of the day, Mi Familia Vota has been doing this work for over 15 years, and we've been fighting tooth and nail to ensure that we can be a voice for our community. And the pandemic is not going to stop us from continuing that work.
Thank you, Yara, and thank you for those questions. Yes, it's been so difficult this year when you have the top of the line executives of this country telling everybody that voting by mail is fake, that there's going to be rigged, that this election is going to be rigged, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. Our work is to make sure that we empower community members to continue to participate in this election, that we see the positives of participation, that we empower them into ensuring that we elect those that are going to represent our values. Um, it's a huge barrier. And I think that the best way to address it is by providing good information out there for the community, being able to provide, uh, call out on the lies and call out on what is right and what is wrong. I think that being able to be that critical source of information, it's key and will shape the next rulings that comes on the Supreme Court justice as well. We have so much at stake in this election. There's a lot of competitive U.S. Senate races across the country. One of those being here in Arizona. And I believe that if we continue to do the right investment and we continue to invite our communities and to provide the right information, our community will show up, participate, and ensure that we have individuals that will move us forward. But that takes all of us and ensuring that our communities that we're filling that gap that, as I've been mentioning across the hour that we've been talking.
Eileen, any last thoughts? You're muted. You're muted.
Oh, I'm sorry, my mic disappeared. No, well, first that, of course, this is a very challenging year for all the reasons that Yara and Eduardo just said. Politically, and on top, we have a pandemic, and this is an election that um, doesn't offer much certainty on what's going to happen on November 4th. From the time that I covered electoral process in the US, this is the first time that I see so many people wondering what's going to happen the day after the election. So I think always, but especially in this occasion, the media has a huge responsibility about what's going to happen that next day. First, in the way they are sharing information. Second, more important, the way they are sharing this information. But also, I think we have to be very aware of what's the tone of the information that we are transmitting, that we are communicating. As Eduardo said, we have a constant message coming from Washington that this election might be rigged, that this election is not going to work. And if the media keeps repeating that idea and that statement without challenging it, we are doing no favor to the communities that we are supposed to serve. I think that more than ever, we have to remember that journalism is service, and that the best service that we can do to our communities in general, but especially our minorities, is to give them accurate information so they can participate and fully engage in the civic life. I really hope most of the media would live this moment in the way they are supposed to. And I also really hope that many, many young people during this process and after the election feel motivated both to join politics or to join journalism in different formats and new structures in order to have a better conversation in the future.
So we ran out of time. I'm sorry, because we can talk about this like forever. I really, really want to thank Eileen, Traux, Yara, Marin, and Eduardo Sainz for attending this event. And students, vote. This is very important, right? So I guess they were very helpful in complementing these discussions that we've been having for so many weeks now, in how important it is to understand Latino communities, to understand the role of Latino organizations, and how these will improve your performance as journalists. When you graduate in 1, 2, 3 years, you're going to be out there, and this is what you're going to do. Thank you very much for the three of you for coming. And it was excellent conversation, and I'm very thankful that you made some room on your very busy agendas to share your opinion with our students.
And thank you for opening the space. I think these
Thank
conversations are helpful for all of us. And thank you to the guys of Mi Familia Vota. Great job.
Thank you so much. It was a pleasure.
Thank you. These were all amazing questions, and we're super excited for all of the work that we're going to put in, and all of the work that you're all going to put in. Thank you again. A pleasure.
Thank you to the students from other states as well, Texas and California. Thank you, everyone. Have a
Take
good day.
care, everybody.
Bye.